Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at civil rights under President J.F. Kennedy. Now Kennedy's administration is only for 3 years because very sadly he was assassinated, but in this short time an enormous amount of key events take place in the history of civil rights in the US, and it is arguably the most significant issue in a significant time period in the development of civil rights in the US. So this video is largely designed to help A-level history students studying 2Q, The American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980, John F. Kennedy, The New Frontier, and in particular looking at African Americans in North and South, the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, the opponents of the Civil Rights, including within the Democratic Party, Kennedy's policies in response to pressures for change. So hopefully I will manage to cover enough of that to give you a really good level of detail, really good starting point. Obviously, with all of these things, it's well worth going out and doing a bit of further research into all these different events. So to start with, look at African Americans in the North. Well, in this period, just like the periods we've looked at before, poverty and discrimination remained the key issues for African Americans in the North. Many in the big cities were dependent on low-paid and insecure work, and data from the 1960 Civil Rights Commission showed that black people's life expectancy was 7 years lower than that of white people. Infant mortality was twice as high, and over half of the housing that African Americans lived in was substandard. So, a fairly grim picture. Now, there was a kind of a separate civil rights movement in the North. Malcolm X was one of the most well-known Northern civil rights leaders, and he was made famous by the Hate That Hate produced TV documentary of 1959, and through meeting with foreign leaders, including meeting with Castro when he was there for the United Nations meeting. He met Nasser as well. From Egypt. He also was friends with Cassius Clay, who went on to become known as Muhammad Ali. So Malcolm X really is probably the best thought in terms of the explanation of how an awful lot of people, African Americans in the North, felt, and he achieved a really high profile. He had incredibly strong oratory skills. He used the media effectively. He clashed with King on methodology. However, Malcolm X, although having a really high profile, did not maybe achieve a huge number of direct successes. The barriers in the North, things like the inbuilt long built-in discrimination, poverty, these were really big issues to tackle, and he has an impact, but it's very difficult to kind of draw a line straight from A to B and say this happened because of Malcolm X. He is very important to us, and King himself, although often displaying opposing views, particularly in terms of the ideas of non-violence and passive resistance to Malcolm X, he viewed Malcolm X as a really important part of the struggle as a whole, saying the white authorities became increasingly willing to engage with King and his side of the movement because they feared the alternative was the movement would turn to the more radical voices such as Malcolm X. So in that, Malcolm X played a really important role in all the successes that the civil rights movement has at this point. In terms of African Americans in the South, well, there had been some great victories, such as Brown versus the Board of Education, and that should have ended segregation in the South. And there was a series of further Supreme Court decisions that followed it, but segregation remained. And frustration grew in the South as the unfair system was held in place, and white politicians were elected on promises to fight desegregation. An example of this is George Wallace, who was elected governor of Alabama in '62, saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So we can see we've got a picture here which doesn't match. The law is saying, the Supreme Court of the country is saying segregation is over. It's unjust. It must go. And then you've got politicians getting elected in the South who are saying segregation is right and it should be here to stay. even slower really than the changes in the law. And the changes in the law were taking far longer than they ever conceivably should have done, was the changing amongst attitudes amongst many of the white southern population. So even when laws changed, discrimination, abuse, and violence towards the African American community continued. This adversity made the civil rights movement increase its efforts to achieve equality in the South. So the slow movement on desegregation, the continued discrimination and racism displayed in the South, the election of politicians like George Wallace really galvanized the civil rights movement in the South to push as hard as it could to achieve progress. And so we see the rise of the civil rights movement. And there were various kind of key events and key tactics and things that we used. Continuing from the time of Eisenhower, we've got the sit-ins. So it started at a Woolworths counter in North Carolina, and the student sit-in process spread across the South. The movement soon included 50,000 students in 30 venues across 7 states. It led to the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, and its formation happened at a meeting that was held and led by Ella Baker. And we also see a significant event when King it takes place in the sit-in in 1960, and Kennedy acted to ensure his release. And this was a clear sign to the civil rights movement that when he was then elected, that these movements should continue and that they would see greater success. And so this is one of the reasons why we can explain the rise of sit-ins that start under Eisenhower and then massively spread under Kennedy, because there was a belief that Kennedy would listen. We also see the freedom rides. In 1961, CORE decided to repeat the 1947 journey of reconciliation, as waiting rooms and restaurants in the South remained segregated. So the desegregation of interstate transport hadn't essentially taken place, because you'd go to the South, you go to a stop, the washrooms there would then be segregated, the waiting rooms would be segregated, the restaurants would be segregated. James Farmer, the leader of CORE, led a group of 13 riders, 7 of which were black, 6 were white, to travel from Washington to New Orleans. The ride was met with horrendous violence. Riders were beaten and attacked at various stops. The most extreme was at Anniston in Alabama, where the bus was firebombed and the raiders were badly beaten. In fact, the riders came close to being burnt alive. There's various stories about how they escaped, but the mob essentially tried to pin them in the bus, which had been set on fire. Now, a lot of the attacks on the riders was led by the KKK. We see in Anniston, the local black community came out in force to protect the riders who had been refused treatment in the local hospital, and a mob had kind of grown outside, and so the black community went in to protect the riders. Robert Kennedy called for a cooling off period and secured agreement from the governors of Alabama and Mississippi to protect the riders. And it's often the case that JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, is by far and away the driving force in his civil rights policy. We then see 300 riders making their way to Jackson in Mississippi, all of whom were arrested. Robert Kennedy applied pressure to the Interstate Commerce Committee, and in November '61, they ended all segregation on interstate travel and facilities. This was a huge victory for CORE, and the shocking images of the attacks on the riders and the burning bus were shown all across the USA and all across the world, creating a kind of really negative press for the US. And this, I think, more than anything else, this negative media bit and this film footage, which could be shown in the USSR and across the world, was one of the things that kind of really forced Kennedy's hand into acting, because he couldn't have these images continually going out, and it would damage the US's position in the Cold War. The protests in Albany were an important staging post in the development of the civil rights movement. Now, the SNCC challenged segregation in Albany, Georgia. There were sit-ins at restaurants, libraries, parks, and buses. There was also marches and boycotts. And one of the criticisms of the campaign is that it lacked focus. It was kind of a little bit of everything all over the place. Now, what really makes Albany stand out was that the Laurie Pritchett, the local police chief, did not fall into the same mistakes that other places had happened, and he kind of looked at when the freedom rides and sit-ins and other protests had been really successful. And what had happened is there'd been a violent response from the local authorities, which had attracted the media. This had then caused an enormous storm and led to intervention by the president and the federal government. So what he didn't do is he didn't react using violence. He didn't crowd African Americans into cells, so he made sure there was plenty of jail space, so they weren't all crowded into one cell with loads and loads of different people in it. And he told the police not to target King and treat him very gently when he came. I mean, it turned out King was arrested. He was offered either a time in jail or a fine. King chose the time in jail, but Pritchett reacted by paying the fine. The authorities paid the fine, and so King was released without there being an enormous amount of fuss. And all this meant that there was a kind of lack of media interest, and King left after his release to work on campaigns elsewhere. The SNCC kept going, but and although there was divisions in the movement and splits and some conflict with other local civil rights group, in the end, the SNCC's work did secure an end to segregation in Albany. But all this happened far more quietly and after the focus of the media had turned away. So Albany was ultimately a success. It's often seen as a failure for King, as King's involvement. It came in, didn't really achieve anything, and it showed a kind of a difference in reaction from the authorities than we see elsewhere. And it really highlighted, I think, to the civil rights movement that what they needed in an adversary is they needed someone who was going to massively overreact, do terrible things, and therefore cause a media storm that would force greater action from the president and his administration. Now they're going to find that in Birmingham. Now there's in between the two, we've got the events in Mississippi with James Meredith. James Meredith enrolled in the University of Mississippi. The NAACP had taken his case through the courts in October '62. Was enrolled. There was horrendous riots, and 2 people were killed in these riots. The U.S. Marshals and the Army were sent in to keep order, and Meredith would go on to graduate in political science. And so we see again more of the segregation being overturned, but we still see this violent reaction against progress that is being made. And the biggest example of this is Birmingham. Now, whilst Albany had failed to gain media attention due to the muted response to the local police, they get the absolute opposite in Birmingham. Now, Birmingham is targeted because it is seen as one of the most racist places in the US at this point in time. It was nicknamed Bombingham due to all the bombings carried out by the KKK, and with the police controlled by Eugene Bull Connor, who had allowed the KKK to attack the Freedom Riders in 1961 as they'd stopped in Birmingham. Birmingham really was the place where segregation was completely ingrained, and that with Bull Connor at the helm, the civil rights movement was going to get that reaction that was going to lead to a set of film and images that would really push the civil rights movement forward. So the SCLC led marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. King was arrested and kept in solitary confinement, where he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, which is a really important primary source that you should make sure you have a look at. We also then see, whilst King is in prison, a decision was made to use young children in the demonstration. This was a very controversial decision, one that King was not sure about to start off with. O'Connor deployed officers with clubs, dogs, which often attacked the protesters. There was the children were arrested in huge numbers, and then we even had these use of these high-pressure hoses that were knocking people over and pinning them against buildings and causing significant injury. These shocking images of all this that was going on were shown across the world. Kennedy's administration secured King's release. And then you got the political pressure from Kennedy and his administration. You've also got the economic impact on all Birmingham's businesses of the protests and boycotts and sit-ins. And this started to be particularly marked. Robert Kennedy sent negotiators in to work on desegregating Birmingham. And that act of desegregating Birmingham did progress. However, the violence continued. King's Motel was bombed, leading to 3,000 troops being moved into the area, and the federalizing of the Alabama National Guard became kind of a threat that was used against the authorities in the area and the state authorities who were kind of not doing enough to stop the violence against African Americans. Segregation continued to progress, but a horrendous event on the 15th of September when the KKK bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, a black church in Birmingham, and the bombing resulted in a number of injuries and very sadly the death of 4 young girls. So with great horror, Birmingham lived up to its nickname of Bombingham, and what it really did is it highlighted these horrendous attitudes that were in places like Birmingham, and the injustice and the violence that people faced, and the images galvanized not only the movement, they galvanized a much wider group of people. That galvanized Kennedy's administration in that something had to be done, that progress needed to be made. And this culminated in the movement with the March on Washington. It was organised by the Big Six. So in this, we see the various civil rights movement groups coming together. So we've got James Farmer from CORE, John Lewis from SNCC, we've got Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, Whitney Young from the Urban League, A. Philip Randolph from the Sleeping Car Porters, and Martin Luther King of the SCLC. So we've got all the big movers together. On the 27th of August, 63, we see the March on Washington, 200,000 marchers at least in these enormous crowds. And it was aimed to put pressure on Kennedy to bring forward civil rights legislation and also to highlight economic discrimination that was taking place across the US. So the march was a march for jobs and for freedom. Kennedy, not hugely enthusiastic to start off with, kind of nervously endorsed the march. He posted 19,000 troops, but none of the marchers were arrested, and all things went fairly smoothly. Obviously, the March on Washington is made most famous again by another primary source, which you must spend some time looking at. I do believe this is one of, if not the greatest speech of all time, which is King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which had an enormous impact. King becomes Times Magazine Man of the Year in '63. He's given the Nobel Peace Prize in '64. So in this, we see arguably an enormous turning point in the civil rights movement. Now, the march is significant in itself. The "I Have a Dream" speech is significant in itself. The combination of all these things and the events that have gone before that have led up to it mean that this is a really important point in the movement. Through all of this, the civil rights movement faces opposition, lots of which I've touched on as we've gone through. You've got what are known as the Dixiecrats in the Democrat Party. So these are Southern white Democrats, and they operate both in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and in state positions such as governors and state legislatures. And they did everything they could to stand in the way of civil rights. So senators such as Strom Thurmond, who's at the top, the picture at the top, Harry Byrd and Sam Everin use filibusters and their powers in committees to block, delay, it kind of strip the power out of various parts of civil rights and voting right legislation. George Wallace was governor of Alabama, and I mentioned him earlier with his idea of segregation yesterday, today, and forever. He stood on the steps of the University of Alabama, one of the last universities to desegregate, trying to prevent it from being desegregated in '63, and he essentially he ran on that platform of fighting desegregation. So with the wielding of this political power, it made it difficult for Kennedy's administration to make a huge amount of progress, and very notably in this, remember, Kennedy is a Democrat president. These are Democrat these are Democrat politicians. They're Democrat members of Congress and the Senate. They are Democrat governors and members of state legislatures, etc. And so what Kennedy is facing here is a real struggle within his own party. And we're seeing a real struggle for the soul of the Democrat Party at this point in time. Other opponents we see then, so we see our organized groups. So we've got kind of two sides to this. We've got the White Citizens Councils and the KKK, to name a couple of them. The White Citizens Council exerted economic pressure. They spread propaganda. They're often joined by business owners, wealthy members of society. They gave these white citizens societies a great deal of power in their local area. So again, they could make sure that their employees didn't go on marches or apply pressure on them to stop them from getting involved in this thing, so act as they wanted them to do. And the KKK used violence and murder. So we see two different sets of organisations that are acting in different ways, but both with the same aim, which was to promote racism and prevent desegregation and development of civil rights. Now, we have to be mindful behind all of this is just the general members of the population in the South. Now, there isn't uniformity in people's beliefs at this time, and there isn't uniformity in people's actions. Now, what we do see at many of these key points in the civil rights movement, then we see what is often referred to as the mob, often stirred up by the organisations above and the Dixiecrat MPs that I mentioned earlier, who would go out and protest and often clash violently with the civil rights protesters. They would attack people in sit-ins. We saw the attacks on the freedom rides, again, often instigated by the KKK, but other people get pulled in as well. And what we see in what is said, the actions that are taken, the reactions to the protests, the anti-desegregation riots that take place, we see a real deep and widespread racism, particularly in the South. We see fear of change, fear of desegregation, and this makes the whole process very, very difficult. And politically very difficult as well, because you've got groups of people that, when you push for civil rights, you're going to lose their votes. And Kennedy, as we've already mentioned, is seeing his party kind of splitting over all this as well. So how does Kennedy respond to all of it? Well, there are areas where Kennedy acts. So, for example, in employment, he created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to ensure equal employment opportunities for African Americans in federal jobs. He was horrified to find how few African Americans there were in federal jobs, and also spread that influence as far as they could, really, with the work of the commission also applying to companies with federal contracts. In terms of voting rights, we see 57 cases brought by the administration against southern states violating black voting rights. However, we do see the administration backing down to pressure from Democrat senators over voting rights in Mississippi in '63. largely what we see is Kennedy being reactive rather than proactive. So he makes gestures to the civil rights movement, freeing King, for example, through showing a degree of support for the various actions by sending in National Guard or the army to protect those who were being attacked by the desegregation mob and groups. With the pressure applied particularly through his brother Robert Kennedy to ensure desegregation takes place in these different areas. Kennedy seems particularly motivated as when there is a huge amount of media coverage and images and film that are going to be very internationally damaging in the context of the Cold War. So again, some historians have questioned his kind of motivation on some of this. And we do ultimately see him act in terms of the Civil Rights Bill, which kind of feeds out of the March on Washington. And it's said that the TV footage of what was happening in Birmingham made him determined to act, though Kennedy himself was never confident that he would have got it through Congress. And it's one of those things where it's only following his assassination that the Civil Rights Bill becomes a Civil Rights Act, and so it actually becomes an act under Johnson rather than under Kennedy. Whether it would have got through under Kennedy is something we can never be absolutely sure of, but most historians severely doubt it. So I hope that's given you some insight into what is a hugely significant part of the civil rights movement and a really important part of this course in general in looking at the development of the USA. So thank you very much for watching. If you've liked the video, please hit like. If you have any comments or questions, please leave those below. If you haven't already subscribed to Alan History, then please do. There's loads more videos on this topic and on a whole variety of other history topics, as well as UK and US politics. So lots of different things on lots of different courses and lots of different units. So hopefully you can find some stuff that you will find interesting and that will help you in your studies if you are studying. I'll see you all again soon.